Hi, I'm Jennifer Branch. Today we're going to paint the Portland Head Lighthouse. It's just a classic American lighthouse, absolutely beautiful with the bright orangey red roof and the blue ocean, and there's greenery, and this is going to be fun. So let's get started. Happy painting! I'm using rough press paper because there's a lot of texture. There's the sky with the trailing clouds, and there are the rocks, and there's the water, and there's the rough stucco of the lighthouse stone, and just lots of texture and interesting things going on. So I'm starting off with the sky. I painted some ultramarine blue up at the top, and now I'm pushing it back a little bit cooler with the cobalt blue. And the most important part of this painting, besides the lighthouse, is the sky. It's this gorgeous sky that just seems to go on forever. And it's going to take a couple layers, but I'm starting out with some pale blues, nothing exciting. You can see how it's this endless sky. And the water's not too important, a little bit of texture, a little bit going on. It's really all in the sky. So just ultramarine blue and cobalt blue, alternating, sending some areas forward, some areas back. The sky overhead has a little bit more ultramarine in it for right now. And this was late morning. We usually get to Portland in late morning, and it wasn't really sunrise because it was a lot later, but it still had that haze and the purpley blues and some interesting stuff going on. Now, when you're painting an object, just go right over any other shadow areas. So I continued over the lighthouse, and now I'm pulling some things into the rocks, and I'm just going over everywhere. I want to connect everything in the painting together, and this is a particularly tricky one to connect because they're very distinct areas. Usually what most artists do is they connect a foreground with the midground, with the background, by maybe having a tree or some interesting branches. The main connection here is the lighthouse, and that's midground, kind of far. So it's a difficult one to do. It's a very classic view of Portland Head Lighthouse, but those connections are tricky. The rest of the painting's not too tricky, don't worry. Some deep phthalo blue adds that depth in the water. And I'm leaving a little bit of texture in there. Some burnt siennas. And that's very, very dark in that crevice. It's just has the water rush out at tides, and it's quite awe-inspiring. This is a beautiful lighthouse. I'm planning on painting it a couple times for y'all, since it is one of my favorite lighthouses, and you know me, I love lighthouses. So I'm starting with the very classic view, Portland Head Lighthouse, and I'll go to some more unusual views that you may not have seen before, unless you've been there, in which case I sincerely hope you hiked around the whole lighthouse like I did, because there's a lot more than can be seen just from the parking lot. Now it's getting to the interesting layers on the sky. And this one I'm not laying it the entire painting dry. Very often I'm mostly just working around the painting. So while the rocks are drying a bit, I'm working on the sky. I am using ultramarine blue for the base blue again up at the top, but then I'm pulling in a little bit of quinacridone gold and a little bit of quinacridone of ultramarine pink, and that dulls it a little bit, and you get kind of a warm shadow for the clouds. Now this looks very dry, very dark, but what you need to remember about these colors is they dry half as dark as you put them on when it's wet. And so I do have the dulled grays, but I'm still dropping paint in and letting it mix on the paper. And right now it looks like a splotches all over the place, but when it dries, it's going to be exactly what I want. So be brave and put things on very dark, and you're probably going to want to add more dark. Do one more wash even. Just letting a couple drops of color go in, and you see how that has it blurred that blue just enough, but it's still there. So it goes in and out, and it's a little bit softer. I love using rags for clouds. Nothing else really has that soft effect. So this has a lot more of the ultramarine pink in it, which is not the same as ultramarine violet, but really is very purpley. I guess it's a pinky purple. There's only so many ways you can describe purple. I don't know. I think I could come up with a lot. So I'm pulling the color of the sky into the shadow areas of the lighthouse, but I'm leaving everything else very stark white still. And you can tell why I wanted the rough press paper, because I'm using it. I'm really working this rough press paper. I want the cloud texture, the fluffy clouds that are straggling across the sky and going into the distance. I do tend to use a lot of water to blur areas. Just some bright cobalt teal, drop it in there. I'll see, just softening a few edges. That does it. That's all you need. You don't need to scrub at it like crazy or anything. Just soften a few edges. Use the brush you already have. A little bit of water. Make sure your water's fairly clean. I am trying to leave that white reflection on the lighthouse glass white of the paper. If you mess up and paint right over it, it doesn't matter. Just paint it in with a little bit of gouache. This is not a big deal. So I'm dashing the brush around, and I'm going to really have some action going in these clouds. I'm going to want less detail, and they're closer together as they get farther away. So the clouds narrow, closer together, so more just horizontal lines the further they get from you. Just drop in a little bit of color, a couple places, because I do have that bright blue sky in between the shadows of the clouds. Notice how I'm using the grade mixture, but I change it pretty frequently. It only lasts maybe a couple brush strokes or two. And I'm also dropping a lot of color into it. And also those clouds in the background, I'm really working that rough texture. I want them to hit and miss and have that interesting texture. Now the roofs of that little building and the roof of that little building is a bright red, so I don't want to paint over that because that would dull it too much. I don't want much of the horizontal line of the ocean behind. Just a kind of a hint in the distance. I don't want it to distract. It already cuts the painting in half a little bit, and I don't want too much of that. So still working on the sky, dropping some colors in while everything's still wet. I'm using clean water just to move the color around a little bit. Drop a little bit in. I'm softening some edges and just really developing the shapes of the clouds. I want a little bit brighter sky, more intense blue. It's a beautiful sunny day. Cobalt teal is a good glowing blue. Just moving the color around. Off to the side, I want, it's going to blur a little bit into the house, but then the house has a bright red roof and stark white, and I can blur the shadows, but the red roof's a little harder. A few dashes of the cobalt teal, it concentrates your eye, it sends it back. It tells you, those are some horizontal lines from those clouds way in the distance. You just need to suggest it. Pull the color right through the shadows of the objects you're painting. Now I'm going to work with that ultramarine blue. I'm going to use that for some of the reflections on the lighthouse. Notice how I'm moving around the entire painting. That my center of interest is the lighthouse, and the second thing that I'm really interested in is the sky because it's stunning. But I still haven't neglected the rest of the painting. It's all happening at the same time. If you develop it in little piecemeal, I've done the lighthouse, now I can get started on the sky, then nothing's going to be, at the very least, the right values. It's going to be disconnected. Now a little bit with these interesting rocks. The rocks actually are interesting enough that I would love to do a painting just of them. Main rocks, they look like boulders thrown by giants. It's amazing. All these fissures and interesting nooks and crannies, and then there's ocean surf. So there may be some rocks and ocean surf paintings come up sometime. Basically, I'm painting all my favorite things that I paint anyways. I'm afraid that I sent a picture of this painting to my mother-in-law and she snagged it. It's what happens when you send them out to someone else that loves lighthouses as much as I do. I want this really rich dark down here. It's unbelievably dark because it's shadows. I wanted to zoom in a little bit here So I'm going over all the shadow areas in the little house's brick. So I want them to really glow. I'm using nickel azo yellow, which I've recently started using. It's some of the pigments used in the substitute quinacridone gold, and I'm really liking it. It's wonderful. As always, it's M. Graham. I want a very deep shadow on the lighthouse. It's painted black, so it's not really a shadow so much as it's deep and it's dark against that sky. And notice how the sky, it's dried a little bit, so it looks lighter, but it also doesn't appear quite so dark when you put the black of the phthalo blue burnt sienna mix next to it. That really puts it in perspective and pushes it back. And part of painting is you have to know what those colors are going to look like after you've dried them, and also when you've put something next to it. I highly recommend doing color mixtures and practicing. Put your darkest darks next to your lightest lights and next to reds, next to greens, and see how the color changes. Really notice that because it makes a big difference. Now, the reason that I don't paint too many details with, say, a number 6 brush is that I want the details to be loose on this. I don't want very defined, perfectly painted details. That would be terrific for an architectural rendering, but this is not an architectural rendering. It has to be fairly accurate because it's a lighthouse. Everyone knows what the Portland Head Lighthouse looks like. I don't want to paint it wrong, but it doesn't have to be, every single line should not be completely straight. There should be little gaps and holes in the shadows and in every single line that you paint on it. And if you use, say, a number 6 brush, it's way too easy to paint it perfectly. And perfectly is boring. So you want some hit and misses, and that's a lot easier with using either a rigger for the very tiny detail, which it has to have some of, or it isn't going to look right. And using either a rigger or a brush that really is a little large. This is a number 14. If I was doing an architectural rendering, like I said, I'd use a 6 at the max, but I want the looseness. So I'm pulling some of the sky colors. I'm using the same colors that I used everywhere because this is white and it's reflecting what's around it. Shadows are reflecting what's around it, so I need to use the same colors I've already painted. Little bit of a mix here with cobalt teal dulled with a little of that nickel azo yellow. Painting a few of the paint lines in there with broad strokes, and then I'll go back and add a little bit with a rigger just to darken a few details. When it's a house that has the trim on it fairly dark, the reflection is usually darker, but I like to paint everything the trim color and then go in and add the few darks for the dark reflections. Now that red roof really changes things. I did use the cadmium red around in the rocks, and that makes a big difference because otherwise, whoa, that's a bright red and nothing else is that color. So leaving some holes in here. A little bit of reflection on the shingles. The cheater way would be to dim that red, but I can't bear to do that. Going back with a few of the very dark details with my wrecker. Very delicate strokes, hit and miss. But without that really dark green, really kind of a Christmas paint scheme, or a roofing scheme, I guess, it just doesn't look right. I expect that, I know I've seen pictures of it in the snow, I've never seen it in real life. I expect it was something very bright and cheery for the lighthouse keepers during the winter. Now it's starting to look like the Portland Head Lighthouse. Work on those wonderful rocks. Just adding a bit of texture, some darks. And see how the sky is starting to get the endless now that we have the foreground or midground to push it back. Some of the cobalt teal. You want the blues, not just the ultramarine blue for the deep darks, but you want the blue reflections on the rocks. After all, they're glistening with seawater and, they're going to reflect. You can soften some of those reflections with a rag. Now the deep darks. Just beautiful in there. I want to focus on a lot of depth there because it kind of curves underneath where it's had the seawater rushing through it, and I want to show that. A little bit more shadows. I want just a bit of the bright blue in the sky there. Just punch it out a little. You notice that blue showed through from the underneath, from the underwash on the black paint on the lighthouse. So just a few more bright touches. Those last touches can either make a painting or break it. But I'm very happy with this iconic view of the Portland Head Lighthouse. I hope it inspires you to go paint a lighthouse near you. A little bit of the color on the lighthouse itself. Blur the edge of that roof a little bit. And here's the painting after it's dried. I hope you go paint a lighthouse if you have one near you. And if not, get out there and paint. Thanks for watching. For more information, please go to my website, paintingwatercolor.com. I do have a reference photo for those of you who want to paint along. And if you like this video, please subscribe. New videos on Thursdays. Happy painting.